Yeah, look at that. Look at how great that looks now. Wonderful. Well, how about that? I'm finally doing another video on something mechanical, and not another video on the insect game. Hello everybody, I'm Ellie Mechanical. Picture the situation in your mind. It's the day after Midwest Gaming Classic 2024. I've gotten, say, 3 hours of sleep, and that's a generous estimate. The trailer is due back at U-Haul in a couple of hours. Nobody's in the house to help, and I'm really not feeling social enough to go ask around. And so I venture into the trailer on my own and start unloading games. The first two go just perfectly fine. And then comes the third. Yeah. Black Knight 2000 was just slightly too upright of an angle as I lowered it off the trailer. And by the time I realized it was falling forwards, its momentum already exceeded my limited counterweight. The damage was pretty bad. The game is just old enough that only the bottom two corners of the backbox were reinforced with brackets, leaving the top two free to collapse in on themselves under the weight of the machine. And of course, being tempered, the back glass, a really nice $300 piece of painted mirror, shattered into a million tiny fragments. But there was a bright spot in all of this. After vacuuming up all the broken glass, tossing aside some chunks of wood, and plugging the machine in, everything fired up just as it always did. Nothing electronic was broken. I played a very relieved 3-ball game on the completely unharmed playfield. But I still had a smashed backbox. The appropriate way to handle this problem varies from one person to the next. If you're an operator in the 1990s, you take the electronics out, throw the rest of the broken backbox in the dumpster, and use the rest of the machine for parts. If you're an absolute matching serial numbers collector, you cry yourself to sleep over the loss of collector value. Either that or upcharge it on eBay with the description, minor cosmetic damage that just adds to this rare collectible's rich history. Or if you're a restorer, you'd get out the clamps and glue and wood glue and do your best to reconstruct it, or, failing that, seek out one in decent condition from a parted out game, or maybe possibly commission an exact replacement. Or maybe you're me. I don't get this color scheme. It doesn't match the back glass or the playfield art. Putting the lock on the side just makes things inconvenient when the game is sitting in a lineup. The lack of top brackets is what destroyed this thing in the first place, and the bottom is so badly warped I don't think I could ever perfectly straighten it. Maybe it would look nice with rubber T-molding. And maybe I'm just crazy. So after buying a couple thicknesses of plywood, I began slicing, sawing, stacking, rounding, sanding, drilling, routing, and gluing. I only have photos of these steps rather than the video footage, since at the time the idea of doing a video series on it hadn't gone through my head. This set of common woodworking steps gave me a rather massive pile of sawdust, which, rather than being thrown out, went into a paper bag, and this becomes relevant later. I test fitted a couple of pieces and cut out the side runners that hold the back glass and display panel in place. You may notice in the pictures that there seems to be a bit more wood than you might have expected. That's because I'm actually building 3 new back boxes, one for Black Knight, one for the Frankensteinian monstrosity that is my special force, and one for an interesting upcoming project. If you're particularly observant, you might notice that this style does not match the original back box. The front corners are rounded and the side wings hang below the bottom. That's because this design actually comes from my current homebrew project, The Fiery End of Obsidian High, which takes a bit of design inspiration from Bally games from the late 80s to early 1990s. Some of you might wonder if it's okay to make such changes on a machine literally older than I am. And like before, the answer depends on who you ask. Personally, I only care that my games are reliable, well-built, and easy to share with the community. Whether or not I could overprice them on eBay for originality is not a concern of mine. After all, pinball machines have been printed with this message for as long as any of us have been alive. Now, let's talk about reliability. I didn't want my design to suffer the same Achilles heel that the old one did, and so reinforcing everything became a top priority. The actual corner brackets can be purchased from Pinball Life, but since I would need 12 of them, for reasons that'll become clear shortly, I figured I could get by cheaper by making my own. Since my fleet of tools does not include a bending brake, I started with a piece of angle iron and a reciprocating saw that cut through it like butter. After measuring a couple sizes for top and bottom and cutting out all the pieces, I smoothed out the edges with a bench grinder. To those unfamiliar, yes, sparks are normal for this process. A bit of mallet tapping squared the brackets off at sharper angles. And once that was done, I had a full set of 12 brackets. For much cheaper than... well, I guess I saved $5 and got some YouTube content. I thought we were ready for assembly at that point, but during a final inspection of the original box, I discovered I had been mistaken. There's a groove cut into the roof of the original Backbox for removing the back glass. And without that groove, you either need a shorter back glass, and they're not made to order, a shorter display panel, and I certainly don't feel like making that modification, or cut out material from the bottom instead. Since I had already glued the top trim in place and couldn't fit a router in there by that point, I went with the last option. With the dimensions figured out, I marked where the holes needed to be drilled to bolt the boxes together. Doing this all in place worked out decently, with no problems whatsoever. But for most of them, I laid out a few individual pieces on the counter to get the job done. Once I had marked possible bolt locations on the angle iron's elongated holes, I drilled them all out. All of them, definitely not missing any. And then it was time to glue. Well, hug a cat first. After applying some old and nearly dried up Titebond 2, I spread the glue evenly along each surface, holding the pieces together for curing with spring clamps. The full design is able to stay together on its sides simply through force of gravity, so this was the ideal position for assembly and allowed me to use a couple of heavy objects to hold it all together overnight. Once the glue had cured, it was time for the bolts, at least temporarily. To begin the process, I ran a carriage bolt through each of the corner holes and tightened a nut onto it. This pulls the bolt through the other side, enough to carve the square-shaped hole it sits in, and makes it easier to fit these particularly short bolts through with enough thread to get through the brackets. This is entirely my fault for cheaping out on hardware, and Biscuit had a few words to say to me about it. That was not part of the video that I was planning. Hi. You're a baby. The brackets weren't absolute clones of each other, so I marked each one for which corner of which back box just to make sure the holes would match up for sure. This went pretty well. Mostly. Hey, look, I definitely remember to drill every single hole. Hi, Biscuit. Are you being my little helper? Are you being my little helper? Oh yeah, you're being my little... Okay, you're biting me, whatever. Plywood isn't always perfect, especially if you buy relatively low-density import birch to help with weight reduction, and my occasional small panel gap was made considerably worse by the tiny voids and holes all over the wood edges. Thankfully, the next step was guaranteed to fix that. I mixed up a few small batches of fiberglass resin in a ratio of 1 ounce or about 30 milliliters of resin with 10 drops of clearly very potent hardener. Typically, this is followed up with a glass fiber additive, but in the interests of preserving the wood body of my joint fills, I substituted sawdust instead. This made the mixture a bit thicker and finally put to use the byproducts of the original cutting and routing. I spread the resin over every bare or unpleasant wood joint, letting it seep into cracks and gaps between pieces. Where necessary, I taped areas off to let it pool in corners and fill larger holes. The first pass didn't quite cover everything, so once that layer of resin had dried, I gave it a second coat. My reusable resin cups proved extremely useful, since I could just twist them a bit and pull out all the old resin prior to the next batch.
What you doing? This little chipmunk. Hey, how you doing? How you doing, baby?
Having given it a day to cure, it was time to sand it down, and I quickly remembered that doing it manually would be an unbelievable inconvenience. So, I brought out the power tools, making things just a bit more automated. Even so, this process brought me horrible flashbacks of Obsidian High's cabinet. There's probably a more appropriate tool to accomplish this task, but this one got the job done eventually. I ended up doing 1 box per night, taking a colossal amount of time and 100 grit to get them all done. This would have been considerably easier if I had switched out resin for Bondo body filler like a sensible person, but if there's one thing this choice guarantees, it will be that the new assembly will be far stronger than the old. Eventually, I did manage to break down the rough resin edges to smoothly meet the wood. So after test fitting a lock assembly and gluing in an extra brace to keep the back glass from trying to flex, it was time to prep for painting. The boxes had plenty of rough edges, so I took care of them with a bit of sanding. During this stage, I realized that one of the wings had an annoying little gouge in the plywood. While I didn't feel like pulling out the resin again, I did have enough not very liquidy wood glue left over to fill it up. Once dried, it's still nice and tough, and I got an unfortunate extra day of drying time thanks to a bunch of rain. And after I'd gone over everything with a rag to wipe away my sanding dust, I affixed the back boxes to my sawhorses with a couple of small spacers to avoid the painted edges doing unpleasant things. Large C-clamps held them in place good enough to avoid problems from wind, and after that, it was prime time. Like the plan for the paint, I used a rattle can primer and coated every surface that will be visible with the back box fully assembled, with some extra allowance for the areas under T-molding. I sprayed the side panels as well. Even though they'll be covered by decals, I wanted to ensure the surface would be as smooth as possible. After being reminded that the outside elements exist, through this tiny setback of finding a hair in the wet paint, I made sure to move everything under a roof to allow it to fully dry. This could totally have gone wrong, but it didn't. As expected, the surface was a bit rough once it had dried. Impurities and wood grain got pulled to the surface. So, prior to the first coat of paint, I sanded every gritty surface until it was nice and smooth. We'll be sanding a second time between coats for a flat and shiny end result. I had a plan for the painting with 2 different brands of paint, Krylon Fusion and Rust-Oleum Double Cover. The idea was to see which one ultimately did a better job. Unfortunately, this did not pan out quite the way I expected. I'm not sure how old my Krylon can was, but apparently the answer is too old. With one can failing at its job, I had to stick with the Rust-Oleum and hope it could cover enough. It was most of the way through the back panel of this back box that I realized I was making a bit of a mistake. This box happens to be the prototype that is missing the cutout notch for the display panel. It's viable for a custom design, but it negates the whole point of that modification to work with a System 11 back glass. And so, I interrupted that process and switched to the other one. To save on paint, the inside was left bare, as is common on production games anyway, and luckily I had enough left in the can to finish the whole thing. The other head was left unfinished, but that's okay. That one's meant for Special Force, a later project, and will probably get recoated in green anyway. And the third back box, you may ask? I'm just going to let that one wait for now. It's for my third homebrew, and I promised myself I wouldn't start that project until Obsidian High was done enough, but I'm sure that cabinet will be very eye-catching in red. I used up the whole can of black for the first coat and a half, plus whatever I painted with it previously, so I picked up a new one, while also discovering they have a better primer that somehow escaped my eyes every previous time I've shopped for it. To avoid issues with outgassing, the paint needs to sit for 48 hours prior to recoating. The day of reckoning was a lot colder than I would have liked, but at least it was sunny. To scuff and smooth the initial coat for a better final, I took some 400 grit to the whole box, which went great, except for one setback. Oh yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to happen. Yeah, look at that. Look at how great that looks now. Wonderful. One that I'm going to ignore and pretend never happened. There'll be a decal over it anyway. With all the prepping taken care of, I took the plunge and covered everything in a second coat of paint. As expected and hoped, this one was fairly uneventful. There's a small bit of bumpiness on the edges from not totally perfect resin, but in comparison to what I'm replacing, I think it'll look quite lovely. Which brings us to the art. I didn't want to stray too far from the original, since I find simple pinball artwork to be rather charming, but I did take the opportunity to tweak it to match the new shape. And in the process, I played with the colors a bit. Comparing my reference photo to contributions on IPDB revealed that my Backbox had been sloppily repainted on the edges by a previous owner, so I had to reconstruct the edges of my lightning bolts. To avoid issues with sizing, I made the full decal a bit bigger than the Backbox measured dimensions, with some guidelines in the corner to help me center them, which didn't backfire on me at all. Once the art was done, I needed only drag and drop my Inkscape file into the magic folder that prints decals, and allegedly it spawned into my hands the very same day. Admittedly, the stickers came out a bit thicker and with a more textured finish than I was expecting, but this is entirely on me, as the print shop had multiple vinyl options and I didn't think to specify which one I wanted. I gave the recoated box a once-over with a rag, hopefully eliminating further roughness to the degree I have patience for, and separated my decals with a pair of scissors. Just as I was ready to apply them, I noticed something very troubling.
See anything wrong with these decals? Here's a fun little fact about decals that go on a symmetrical box. You have to mirror one side. Guess what I didn't do?
If you notice, my hair color isn't as full and vibrant in the narration as it is in the working clips. That's because supply chain issues kept my decals in limbo for a month. I almost considered giving up on decals entirely and attempting stencils and paint, which admittedly would have been pretty cool. I would say maybe next time, but I would rather there not be a next time I have to replace a Backbox I broke. With the decals finally in hand, I was able to dust off my box and get to work, and in the process, made an interesting discovery. Remember those guidelines? Apparently they serve as a signal for the print shop to cut the decals to that size. Oh, what a joyous day! Well, at this point they still looked miles better than the original, and I wasn't waiting any longer. Decal application at this size is typically done by taping the center, cutting away half the backing, then sticking it down. I used a felt-edged squeegee to push it down evenly, generally avoiding bubbles or creases. The right way to handle this would be to leave it sitting flat for a while to get the waviness out, but I challenge you to name any part of this project that was done the right way. There's an excellent guide, courtesy of Professional Restorer High-End Pins, demonstrating how to make perfect decal edges by sanding them off, which I have not managed to do. Fortunately, Old Faithful the razor cutter worked well enough for my purposes. Once the decals were on at long last, I applied the T-molding. I chose yellow for this project since it directly matches part of the side art, and tapped it into my pre-routed grooves with a rubber mallet. Partway through this task, it occurred to me that maybe I should have reinstalled the bolts and reinforcing brackets. Miraculously, the pinball gods witnessed my misfortunes that day and smiled in mercy upon me, and my joints of glue and resin held in place. But, not wanting to take any chances, I took care of the brackets next. Installation, as they say, is the reverse of removal. The other side gave me a little bit of trouble when I was starting off, but after correcting it by hand a little bit, I was able to get it to work just fine. Of course, I still had one edge to take care of, the top, for which I'd been saving a slice of shiny silver trim. This went in the same way as the yellow, with the exception that I cut it just a millimeter too long on the end and scratched my paint. Anyhow, once that was done, I could finally peel away the protective film, revealing the beautiful shiny surface below. And that's how I learned that the reflective coating on my tea molding had, over the course of the years I'd stored it, started to delaminate. And now I have these horrible little groups of creases, no matter how hard I tried to squeegee them down. But really, at this point, it's just par for the course. I retouched the paint scratches with a Sharpie and called it good enough. Well, after all of that, I think it looks terrific. And with that out of the way, this project is finally finished. Oh yeah, I guess we got a few more steps to do, don't we? We sure do. After all, with the box itself constructed, we still need to transfer the hinges, latch plate, channeling, display panel, and all the internal electronics from the old one. As you can imagine, this will be a whole project in itself, especially given some improvements that I plan on making in the process. And thus, to those who have dared endure the pain of watching every possible thing go wrong, I hereby invite you to join me again in part 2. Good night, everybody.